Welcome to the herd and thanks for listening. If you enjoy this sodcast, please like it, share it, give it a good rating, and follow, and help more people find their way into the ruminati herd. If you have suggestions for improvements, please let me know.
I'm just seeing how good you are at these beginnings.
Yeah, well, okay, let's try it.
All right.
Howdy, everybody. Welcome to this episode of the Meet Your Herdmates Sodcast. Today, Sod Father Don Pedro is very pleased to be joined by another of his academic brothers. Jim Gerrish is an author, a speaker, a consultant. He's been working in the area of grazing management for a few years. We won't specify just how many. We'll let him fill that in. How you doing, Jim?
I'm doing very well, Peter. And just to throw it out there, it's 40 plus years.
40 years.
Yeah.
So there's been a few changes over the years, but let's get into this slowly. How was it that Jim Gerrish got interested in grazing management? What did that look like?
Okay. I actually grew up on a crop farm. We did not have cattle. We did not have pastures. So I didn't grow up doing any of the, cattle and pasture stuff. We did grow alfalfa as a cash crop, and we had a custom hay baling business. And yeah, that's the guy who wrote the book, Kick the Hay Habit. Yeah. So when I was a young man working in the custom hay business, I loved it. I like the smell of diesel smoke as much as anybody, and that aroma, fragrance of fresh mown, hay. It was wonderful. It just, as time went by, it didn't make economic sense to do that anymore. So anyway, one summer, my my oldest sister was married to a German, grew up in Argentina after World War II. And his brother ranched down there. And so this was in 1977, I believe, that he came and spent a good bit of time on the farm where, I was growing up. And this guy, he came and they talked about, finishing beef entirely on pasture. He talked about moving the cattle to fresh pasture every day. He talked about the importance of diversity in the pastures, and didn't say the word soil health, but basically said that the first thing we have to look after is the soil. And so that was my first exposure to something different than what the neighbors who had cattle did, which was basically, if you couldn't farm a piece of ground, it was wasteland, and so it was pasture, and you threw some cows out there. And it was continuous grazing. It was no management. It was land degrading. And this guy from Argentina came and talked about a completely different way. So that was my first introduction to it. And he actually got his training in grazing management from Madame Voisin, which meant nothing to me at the time. But Andre Voisin wrote a book called Grass Productivity, which in my view is the most significant book on grazing management written in the 20th century. And after his death, his wife traveled through South America teaching grazing management. And my sister's brother-in-law, Martin Rostel, was one of those individuals who learned grazing management from Madame Voisin. So I mentioned that book. When I started graduate school, I actually went to University of Kentucky on a plant breeding assistantship, decided I wasn't very interested in plant breeding, and asked to switch to some other program. And they had a new faculty member from New Zealand, Chuck Doherty. You've heard that name, I'm pretty sure, Peter.
Yeah, I have. I'm somewhat familiar.
Yeah, that's what makes Peter and I academic brothers, is we were both students of graduate students of Chuck Doherty. And so Doherty was coming over to take the pasture ecology position. I had no idea what pasture ecology meant. I didn't know what grazing management we were really going to get into. And so I just went to the library and started pulling books off the shelf about grazing. And I had the good fortune in 1978 of pulling Andre Voisin's Grass Productivity book off the shelf and read it at the beginning of my academic career. And it was unlike anything else I was exposed to as undergraduate or later on in graduate school. But it is the Andre Voisin is who really shaped my perspectives and understanding of grazing management. So
now, where did you grow up?
Southern Illinois.
Southern Illinois. Did you go to Berea, or am I confused about that?
You're confused about that.
Okay.
I went to a community college close to home, Kaskaskia Community College, then finished undergraduate at University of Illinois in agronomy, then went to graduate school at UK.
Okay. And then after UK, you went to University of Missouri, and you
Right.
ended up in a grazing research farm in northern Missouri.
Right.
Is that?
The University of Missouri's Forage Systems Research Center, about 100 miles from the main campus at Columbia, up in North Missouri. And I'm one of those rare people who I only ever applied for one job out of graduate school. I only ever had one job interview, got that job, and spent 22 years, 3 months in that position at University of Missouri, working in grazing research, primarily with beef cattle. We did some sheep work, and then I did a little, cooperative grazing work with some of the dairy scientists too. But primarily it was plant, soil, animal relationships in grasslands grazed by beef cattle. That's where my research focus was.
And there are a number of publications that are still available from University of Missouri. The title Management-intensive Grazing. So what's the thought behind that name?
Okay, so in probably if we start with the term controlled grazing or time-controlled grazing, when Alan Savory, who was the founder of the holistic management, and it started out as holistic resource management, HRM, then it just became holistic management. So Alan Savory started holistic management, and when he first came to North America from Rhodesia at that time, Zimbabwe now, with his partner, Stan Parsons. Okay, so Alan Savory's a wildlife biologist. Stan Parsons was an agricultural economist, kind of an odd linking there. They worked together initially, teaching a different way of grazing management. And they talked about either controlled grazing or cell grazing. And so we used that term early on. And then sometime in the early 1980s, the terminology became intensive grazing management, IGM. And Bert Smith from the University of Hawaii wrote a book called Intensive Grazing Management, and it had all the concepts, in there, right? But what we found was way too many farmers and ranchers, they were doing the intensive grazing without the management piece of it. Yes, they were using electric fence to subdivide pastures, and they were concentrating their animals in one area, but it was kind of graze it to oblivion and then move on, rather than graze it to an appropriate residual and then move on. And Alan Nation, the editor of Stockman Grass Farmer magazine, and we were on a program together. I think it was I don't remember if it was Iowa Sheep Producers or Iowa Forage and Grassland Council, but we were where so much of our great work took place. We were sitting in the bar at the Holiday Inn restaurant, in the evening after the conference, and bemoaning the fact of all these cattlemen out there who are doing intensive grazing but forgot the management. And at that moment, I said, You know, Alan, we just have the words in the wrong order. It isn't intensive grazing management, it is management-intensive grazing. And I think it's very important that we have the hyphen between the management and intensive. And when I write it, it's always capital M management hyphen lowercase I intensive grazing. Now, it's embarrassing that my book, Management-Intensive Grazing, does not have the hyphen in the title.
Several authors have told me that the author doesn't own the cover, that's somebody else's.
That is correct.
So jumping back just a little bit, because I've thought of this, that what Andre Voisin was doing with his work long predates the technological revolution that we now have. And so he was doing his work with hard fences. And now we have this portable technology that is incredibly flexible.
Yeah. For the listeners, to put it in a time frame context, Voisin worked from about 1920 to his death in 1961. So that's the era that he did his research in, and his writings and teaching. And Pete, you're absolutely right. The management that he is suggesting and recommending is so much easier today because of the technological advances. I don't know why everybody's not doing it. And I don't know if we've probably had this conversation, but James Anderson in Scotland in the late 1700s, basically all of the time management aspects and, stock, increasing animal stock density, reducing pasture size, adjusting the length of the recovery period. James Anderson in Scotland wrote all of that in the late 1770s and 80s. So it's not new ideas, but technology has made it much more feasible. See, back in Anderson's day, if you wanted to move fences, you're moving rocks. Take those rocks and move them every day. Nobody wants to do that.
No, I suspect it was more like they just opened the gate into that little fold in between the rocks and then moved on.
Yep.
And the whole value of legumes in their lay farming systems. And now you've got livestock the new concept of integrating livestock into cropping systems is really coming back to what had been until relatively recently.
Yeah, for thousands of years.
Yeah.
Livestock farming and crops were inextricably linked. And in the Middle East, in Southern Europe, they knew 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, that the soil, the plants, the animals all work together to make the most productive and, just using the S word, the sustainable system. We knew that 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, and industrial farming and specialization is what tore apart the fabric of healthy landscapes, healthy food, healthy communities, healthy people.
I was watching a presentation of yours, and you quoted someone as saying, wire is only as good as your water. That's awesome. You want to explain that?
Okay. The proximity or availability of stock water for the animals to drink, is what really determines how they're going to use the landscape, how far they will travel away. So I grew up in the Midwest, worked my academic career in the Midwest, and then quit academics. Sometimes I get introduced as a retired professor. I quit the university when I was 47 years old because I just needed to do something different in life. And that's when we moved out west here to Idaho. And before I moved out here, I thought that a cow on the range, could walk 10 miles between water holes with a smile on her face. And just everything would be grand. The reality is, and it depends on landscape, but in most landscapes, by the time they are a half a mile away from water, they're already changing their grazing behavior because they're thinking about how soon they're going to turn around and go back to water. And so in big ranch environments like where we are now on rangeland, our target is to not have cattle walk more than a half a mile to water. And that's one of the ways that we can even out grazing distribution, manure distribution, and have a more functional mineral cycle going on, is by shortening the travel distance to water. Now, when I was at the University of Missouri, we did some grazing distribution research in that hot, humid, high-stress environment of Missouri. And we found that, at peak of summertime, by 600 to 800 feet away from the water tank, they were changing their grazing behavior. So if I were working with a cattle producer, say in Western Tennessee, we would be designing the stock water supply to keep the animals within about 800 feet of water at all times. And then this is where the wire being only as good as your water comes into play. Is you could be in West Tennessee and you could, fence your farm into 50 little paddocks. But if you then used a lane that the animals had to get out into a lane, walk a half a mile to a water tank at the barn, and then walk back out to the pasture, it would be terribly inefficient. You wouldn't get the animal performance, the productivity that you want. A whole lot of your dung and urine would end up in that lane. So you would actually be creating almost a point source pollution along that lane. So it became very important to have the water out in every one of those 50 pastures so that the animals aren't traveling so far and they're not depositing all those nutrients in the lane. So whether we're talking about, a huge ranch landscape in the west, or a relatively small farm in the southeast, we use a different distance criteria for how far we'll allow animals to travel to water. But the concept that water location drives grazing distribution, and hence the carrying capacity, the livestock carrying capacity of your farm or ranch, is very closely tied to what your stock water availability is.
And so these investments in infrastructure, many times it's been my experience, too many livestock producers are looking to make investments elsewhere as initial investments, and it's been my experience that the people that pay attention to livestock control, which means water and fencing, is a far better initial investment than major agronomic improvements or some of the other things that we can spend money on.
Right. The majority of degraded pastures that I look at all around the country, if the manager would change the management on those, shift from set stocking to time-controlled management, it would cure most of the problems. We've seen many, many, many examples of what really looked like terrible degraded land. If it's in the wetter part of the country, and by that I'll say any place that gets more than 30 inches of annual precipitation, you can take most degraded landscapes, and in 3 to 5 years of good management, you've got really good pasture out there. In the dry environments, particularly once we get down to 15, 16 inches of precipitation or less, it takes longer to heal the land. But I was just talking with a client in western Oklahoma earlier today, and they'd been, kind of playing with grazing, as we say, and they saw the benefits on their range. And it's a good sized outfit. I think it's like 11,000 acres or something. And they're, jumping in both feet. I think we're looking at something on the order of 15 miles of livestock water pipelines, 50 new drinking points. Now, some of those will be serviced with a portable tank rather than a permanent trough. But from their 3 years of playing with grazing on a smaller scale using portable fence, portable water, they've seen how quickly their range can respond. And I think that's about a 22-inch precipitation environment. This is going to be several $100,000 project, but they, see what the return on that investment is going to be. Mm-hmm. And, based on other projects we've done in similar environments and scale, it's quite possibly going to be 20+% annual. If you look at a 5-year payback on the infrastructure investment you're making, it ends up being a 20+% return on investment.
Yeah, those opportunities are lots of places you can get 20% these days. And
no. I'm missing them.
Yeah. You told me a story relative to water in the part of the country that you live in. You told me of a story that relates to the value of a good horse.
The value of a good horse?
Yeah. The cowboy had a better horse than his neighbor. They both set out.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's the water rights on this ranch that we're living on out here. So where we live, the average annual precipitation is between 7 and 8 inches. We are in the mountains. We're right at the foot of the Lemhi mountain range, and so summer irrigation water here is snow melt directly off the mountains. We don't pump any water. We don't store water in a reservoir. We simply are diverting water, snowmelt water out of the mountain creeks, put it in a pipeline, and we run center pivots off of it. All right, so way back in 1882, two fellows had come in the valley, this area in the late fall, had not been to the county seat, which is Salmon. At that time, they called it Salmon City, and to register their water rights. And so when enough snow had melted that they could travel the 60 miles downriver to Salmon to register their water rights, they basically started a horse race. And there is a 4-hour difference. Our water right, I believe, is April 17th, 10 a.m., 1882. The ranch immediately below us, it's the same day, but it's 2 p.m. Now, neither of these ranches is the current ownership have any kinship, blood relation, descendant from those two original homesteaders. But to this very day, we have the priority water right. And when water starts getting short, rather than everybody sharing in the misery and everybody reducing their share of water something, the way it works here is the lowest priority right, you just get shut off completely. And so the ranch we're on, sometimes we'll be running full tilt water when almost nobody else has any water around. It does not make you very popular in the neighborhood in a tough year, but that's how important, water is here. So that's almost 140 years ago. One guy had a better horse, and so that's why we've got the abundance of water that we have here.
And in Idaho, as opposed to other countries, as opposed to other states, the water right can't be separated from the property. In
our counties, it cannot be separated from the property. There are some locations in Idaho where they have changed
Oh,
those laws. It's on a county by county basis,
okay.
because in your more affluent, more rapidly developing counties, they have to do something different in order to be able to develop and sell these properties. So some places are getting dried out, horribly. They'll never see a drop of water other than natural rainfall again.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been a long time since we've seen a drop of natural rainfall here.
Today's guest is Jim Gerrish. He's a writer, teacher, speaker, consultant, grazing management for almost half a century. How does that sound?
Oh, almost half a century.
Sorry about that. We're the same age, so
Yeah.
karma may not be kind. You, in other presentations, have talked about the cow's job description and the manager's job description. So, what in the world? I mean, the cow signs up, footprint. What's going on here?
Okay. One of the things that really bothers me is when people talk about dumb animals, or a rancher says, that cow's just really stupid. As it turns out, usually if a rancher thinks a cow is stupid, it's actually one of the most intelligent cows on the ranch, because she's figured out how to do something different from what the rancher wants. All right. So every cow really has the skill set, the knowledge to do everything that a cow should be able to do. So when I think about the cow's job description, I mean, and in workshops that we do, this is one of the exercises we have the participants or students do, is write a position description for a cow. Because the way I looked at in any livestock, every animal is an employee of the ranch. So if you've got a ranch with 200 cows, that's a business with 200 employees. If you had a business with 200 employees in salmon, I'm pretty sure you would have written something called position descriptions for the different employees. And that, some people think that that's just so the employee knows what their job is. But to me, it's just as important that the manager know what the employee's job is. So the things that we would put on a position description for a cow is feed herself. It shouldn't be my job to carry hay and put in front of a cow so she can eat, because in the hundreds of thousands of years of cow evolution before they became domesticated, nobody was making hay for them. Nobody was feeding them hay. They were making a living on their own. Another one is find the best bite of feed that you can. A cow inherently knows how to move through a pasture or across the range and find the highest energy, the highest protein plants. They can find mineral plants that have particular minerals in and supplement themselves with minerals. I should not have to pay a professional nutritionist to tell me what my cows need to eat, because she already knows. Okay. She needs to deliver a live calf every year. It should not be my job to be out there in the dead of winter pulling calves out of a cow because she can't have it on her own. That's not my job. My job is to decide who her boyfriend is and when they have their first date. And if I do a good job of that, then I'm never going to have a calf born in the winter, and I'm never going to have to worry about, pulling a calf in the snow and putting it in the bathtub in the house to keep it from freezing to death. All of that stuff that conventional ranching does, I call self-inflicted wounds. It's completely unnecessary to subject themselves and their livestock to those kind of, conditions and activities. I also expect her to spread fertilizer for me. I expect her to incorporate seed into the ground for me. And really important, I want her to come to work every day with a positive attitude. That's there's nothing worse than working with mean, ornery cows. Of course, the only way you get mean, ornery cows is by people making them into mean, ornery cows. Which, have you ever noticed that some employers in town do that? They create lousy employees because they're mean and ornery. All right. So those are the sort of things that are the cow's job. Find her own feed, balance her nutrition, have live babies, keep it healthy, spread fertilizer, control weeds. That's the cow's job. So we think about what's the manager's job. I think in any business, the first responsibility of the manager is to create a working environment where your employees can thrive. So my role as a manager is to create a working environment for these cows where they can be the very best cow that they're genetically capable of being. Now we used the infrastructure word already. I have to maintain and create that infrastructure. I've never seen a cow run through a fence and then turn around and put it back up. So that is my job. And then the other really big one is marketing ranch products. Too many farmers and ranchers, all they do is they sell what they produce. They do not market products. They sell commodities. And there's far more profit potential, far higher revenue possibilities if you are marketing a product rather than just selling a commodity. And for an increasing number of livestock producers, that product is 100% grass-fed or pasture-raised, however we're expressing it. But it's beef or lamb or eggs or pastured pork. It is going directly to the consumer with a product rather than just selling commodities to Cargill and Tyson and whoever.
And one of the things that I don't think enough credit is given is in these systems, they have an impact on wildlife within the landscape that the management is taking place in.
Yeah. What's really interesting, and Savory saw this in Africa years and years ago, and it took him a while to realize it, but we see it in this country also. The best managed, and by best, I don't mean as industrial agriculture defines it because you're using all of the right products, but when we are managing based on ecosystem functionality, or as a lot of ranchers express it these days, ranching in harmony with nature, or ranching with Mother Nature. When we do that, the ranch becomes more productive. We're carrying more livestock, but those ranches also carry most of the wildlife in the neighborhood. Consistently, since we've been here, I look at the neighbor's place in late summer, fall, and it's grazed down, quite short. You don't look over there and see the deer, the antelope, the elk there. We carry more livestock, but we leave more residual behind because we're managing based on time control rather than just space. And the birds, the raptors, the songbirds, and we saw this on our farm in Missouri too. The better job you do of managing livestock to create productive, healthy grasslands, the more wildlife they will share that landscape with.
That was a recent documentary, very short, 13 some minutes, Guardians of the Grasslands.
Yeah.
And there was a quote by one of the managers that cattle share the ecosystem as opposed to converting the grassland to agronomic crops, which obviously is a transformation of the grassland. And
Yeah.
somewhere I've heard what the figure is for the amount of the high rainfall grasslands of the world that have been converted into cropland. And it's the majority of it. Let's just leave it there.
Yeah, I'll just say this at this time. If we are interested in ecosystem function, if we are interested in wildlife diversity, going to 100% plant-based diet is absolutely the worst choice that anyone could make. Even with organic crops, it's still mostly monoculture, farming. Now, small-scale organic CSA is going to have a nice mixture of things there. But if we're looking at industrial organic, which if you're going to any of the supermarkets and even at Whole Foods, a whole lot of what's on the shelf there is industrial organic. It's large monoculture fields, a lot of tillage taking place, and tillage kills life in the soil. And if you kill life in the soil and reduce invertebrate populations there, you're going to be reducing bird populations. You're going to be reducing small rodent populations, which reduces predator populations, so on and so forth. Anytime you're looking at a monoculture plant crop, whether it's organic or industrial, that will not support near the wildlife nor ecosystem services as what healthy grassland does. So, and that's why every farm can benefit from incorporating livestock with their grain crops, their vegetable crops, their fruit orchards. Grazing sheep under various types of orchards is becoming increasingly in demand, because both farmers and consumers are realizing that so many of these orchards that we have that are kept basically as a sterile environment, except for that tree. I mean, peach orchards are beautiful, but they are a monoculture, and they are an biological desert when it comes to soil life, to bird life, and to any larger wildlife. If you convert that bare ground that's under so many of these orchards to grass, and sheep are what are popular to graze in there, and you graze sheep through there, we've changed that from being a biological desert to being a vibrant landscape with more soil microbial life, more soil invertebrate life, more bird life, and even the deer will wander in there. Yeah, and they'll eat the peaches and stuff. Small price to pay.
Well, right now in Western Oregon, we have a lot of the grass seed ground that's being planted into hazelnuts. And you drive by these, and right now there's, the small trees are maybe 3 foot tall, but there's everything. It's bare ground already. And so exactly that point, you can see the same thing in the almond orchards in California.
Avocados, that's where I really, it was really brought home to me. Because I work in grazing lands, not farms or vegetables or stuff, but I had a client in California who was doing what we would call a full cart CSA. They wanted to provide vegetables, fruits, nuts, meats, poultry, all of those things. And that's the first place where I actually went and walked in an avocado orchard. And they were converting this property from conventional farming to organic and biodynamic farming. And my jaw dropped and said, wow, is this really how they do it? Makes you not want to buy anything, buy avocados. And avocados, I love avocados. They're a wonderfully healthy thing, but I'd sure rather get them from a tree that a sheep was grazing under and pooping under.
Or, eat a steak, what have you. It just makes us look at animal source foods differently from an environmental perspective when we realize these things. So we've already alluded to the kick the hay habit. And maybe this ties in with another question, which is, how does grazing management differ if you're in a cow-calf operation or in a feeder, a stocker, feeder, finishing kind of operation, or if you're in a dairy? Because you wouldn't manage those or set them up the same way.
Okay. So in a beef cow-calf situation, usually your expectation is you're going to be owning these animals 365 days of the year, the cows. If you're raising calves to be 7 or 8 months old and then you're selling them, the calves are only there for a period of time, but the cows are there 365 days a year, which means they have to eat something 365 days of the year. And there's been analysis after analysis after analysis done that basically says the number one driver of profitability in the cow-calf business is simply feed costs. So we have to look at lower cost ways of feeding the animals. And if you have set stocked pastures, so there's no infrastructure out there, you're not doing any management, you have very little input cost ongoing on that acre, but you have the overhead costs associated with it. And if set stocking we'll just say in this environment, gives you 100 cow days per acre, and really top-notch management gives you 200 cow days per acre, you have just cut your overhead cost per unit of production in half by producing that 200 cow days per acre. And so you can afford to invest some into labor for management, into the infrastructure, because you're getting so much more out of it. And so basically in the cow-calf business, every day that you can graze is money saved compared to feeding that animal hay. How big is the cost differential between them? If we go back to our example of set stocking and only producing 100 cow days per acre, grazing is still going to be somewhat cheaper than feeding hay, but it's surprisingly not that much different because the overhead costs per cow day are so high. So if you can increase your productivity per acre largely through changing the grazing management, then our cost per day, the marginal difference between feeding hay and grazing becomes more and more favorable to grazing. And so that's what really drives this idea of kicking the hay habit, is that grazing, or really making hay, is so much more expensive than it used to be. Like when I was growing up in the custom hay business, the large round hay baler, so the one that makes, the big load or round bales out there, we bought our first one in 1973 and paid, I think it was either $4,200 or $4,800 for it. An equivalent piece of equipment today is at a minimum going to be $48,000, probably higher. So that piece of equipment, it costs 10 times more today than it did then. If we look at the value of our product, beef, in 1973 versus today, the price of beef has only increased about threefold. So the cost of the equipment to make the hay has gone up tenfold. The value of the product only threefold. We look at the cost of diesel fuel. I used 1973 as a benchmark. One of the reasons that I graduated from high school that year, but also it's what the finished beef price was in July of 1973 in terms of inflation-adjusted dollars, so consumer buying power. That is the highest beef price we have ever seen in the U.S. About, what was it, 6 years ago, when prices seemed to go sky high, and wow, this is huge prices. That in inflation-adjusted dollars, that was only about 2/3 of what the price of value of beef was in 1973. So you look at the cost of fertilizer, cost of fuel, price of labor, cost of the equipment. All of those things have increased at 3 to 4 times the rate that the value of our product. So what made sense as an operating model in 1973 does not make sense anymore because of that change in cost of the inputs and value of the output. And unfortunately, because it's a generational business, farming and ranching is in many cases, some of the old guys and gals on the farms and ranches, they still remember that wonderful day in 1973 when they got that phenomenally high beef price, and they remember how they were operating, and they're still living in those days, and they have forced that on their children. One thing I've noted about agriculture is most of us operate in the economic paradigms of our parents of the previous generation. And because the economy is constantly changing, and today it changes at an even faster rate, you can't live a generation behind and expect to be profitable on this landscape. So you have to change. And that circles us all the way back to where we kind of started this conversation with what's really a new idea.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the challenge, of course, in forage agriculture is we're producing a crop that we have to convert into a saleable product.
Mm-hmm.
That we can't. I mean, some people can make hay and are in that business, but they're also doing it at a different scale, and they're doing it to a degree that it's probably not wise for livestock producers, for the most part, to look at making the investment in equipment and inputs and everything else to harvest. So, but let's maybe take a step and say, so what is it about management that could change? You can't increase the growing season much. You might protect some early season growth by not having animals on it right away. What other kinds of things could you be doing that shifts the feed from in time? And you've mentioned that too, time versus space management. So that might be a good thing to talk a little bit about.
Okay. And I realize a lot of the listeners are, they're listening to the program from their interest in human nutrition, and they're not necessarily familiar with a lot of specifics of ranching. So there's a term we use that is called stocking rate. And stocking rate is the number of animals that we put on the farm for a defined period of time.
And this would be on the effective grazing area, not...
Yeah, on the effective grazing area. And because grass does not grow at the same rate every year, and depending on where you are in the U.S., you might have 5 months where absolutely nothing grows, but you still have animals that need to eat something. So we talk about having a flexible stocking rate. And that means that you are going to change the number of animals and type of animals that are on the pasture seasonally. And so I'll come to the cow-calf example. If you have a cow-calf operation and you base your stocking rate on your summer grazing capacity, that pretty well guarantees that you're going to have excess forage in the spring that you're probably going to cut for hay. You're going to have nothing left at the end of the growing season because basically by definition, we said we were stocked at our summer capacity. So the end of the growing season gets here and there's nothing left standing in the pastures. So now you have to feed all that hay that you made in the spring of the year. That's what happens when you have a fixed stocking rate based on summer grazing capacity. what I say in classes and what I tell our clients is you base your cow herd size not on your summer grazing capacity, but on your winter grazing capacity. And that is how you guarantee yourself that you won't have to feed hay in the wintertime, because that number is going to be lower than what based on summer grazing capacity is. Yes, you are going to have surplus feed in the spring. And this is where the flexible stocking rate comes into play. So we look at what are our opportunities of bringing additional livestock onto the farm to utilize in that shorter period of time, which is typically May, June, July, maybe into August for a big part of the U.S. That's when we have the excess amount of growth. So we're looking at a livestock enterprise where we can buy animals or custom grazed animals, lease animals to come in and harvest that. And what a lot of ranchers do is they are going to bring in what we call stockers or yearling cattle. So these are calves that were born the previous year, overwintered somewhere, and then brought out to pasture in the spring. Usually those animals are going to be of a weight class that you will not have any finished animals, when August rolls around that you can sell for grass-fed beef. So those yearling cattle, get sold back into the commodity system and they go to a feedlot. They might get picked up by someone doing grass-fed beef because now you've added 300 pounds to their weight and they're closer to finish. But another class of animals that you could bring in are skinny cows, skinny open cows. So an open cow is a cow that isn't bred. In the U.S. right now, just over 60% of the beef consumed in the U.S. is ground beef. You do not have to have a USDA choice steer to produce hamburger. Within the grass-fed meat sector, I believe that number is around 70%. 70% of the grass-fed beef consumed in the U.S. is as ground beef. And so if you bring these thin cows in, they lost their calf at calving time in the winter, or they weren't even bred the previous year, and the cattle producer did not preg check to determine pregnancy status. So spring rolls around and here's a cow they've kept all winter, but it gave no calf, so they sell it. You can take a thin cow and turn her into very good hamburger in 60 to 90 days. And so using the open thin cow as you're harvesting your excess forages in May, June, July is a really good option that actually consistently gives one of the best returns in the beef business, is just fattening cull cows. So there's different options to do, but that's part of the flexibility in stocking, right?
And then at the fall end, the stockpiling option of allowing pasture to grow and then ration it off once we exit the growing season is used in a lot of parts of the country. Further north, I know actually swathing, harvesting, and letting it sit in the field as a swath and then rationing that out with strip tillage, strip grazing, fencing, even under snow, that remarkably enough cattle can graze through snow. How they ever survived before we invented balers, I don't know, but lots of things along that line. So we've touched on a number of topics, and one of my growing interests is the whole area of global food systems and what has to happen in other parts of the world for all the reasons that we're rightly concerned about in this country. Arguably, they're at least present, if not worse, in some of these other areas. So you've talked a lot about working in the US, and I know you visited places like Australia. Have you visited other parts of the world, or do you have any thoughts about how what you've learned over the course of your career could impact favorably sustainable food systems in low and middle income countries?
Okay. Yes, I've worked in several South American countries, Mongolia, uh, Mexico, and um, the idea that the American farmer is supposed to feed the world is one of the very worst concepts or ideas that has ever been put forward. It's a political buzzword. But it's terrible. The position we need to be in worldwide is local economies feeding local populations. Globalization, it's very much a two-edged sword. And I think when we start talking about food systems, food reliability, food security, globalization is absolutely one of the worst paths we can go down. I don't remember the year. I think it was about '05 or '08. I remember FAO report that was really touting that it is local, organic agriculture production, community-based food production that is going to allow us to feed 9 billion people on this planet. The industrial food model, we know that the nutritional value of food has been steadily declining since approximately World War II. It's less nutrient dense. Just nutritionally, we are putting ourselves into a worse and worse and worse position with the industrial food system. And just what we need is 2 billion more people on this planet eating crap and becoming less and less healthy. So they're more and more susceptible to coronaviruses, whatever the next thing they throw at us is. We are making ourselves less and less functional as a species through the industrial food system. The foundation of healthy food is healthy soils, and there's no aspect of the industrial food system that is doing anything to create healthy soils that make healthy food. The worldwide revolution, well, I think we need to have a dozen different worldwide revolutions, but one of the biggest ones is get away from this idea that American farmers are supposed to be feeding the world. That's what's killing the world. It's what's killing their agricultural economies. So I think we should be exporting, our knowledge of soil health, regenerative ranching, how to build carbon in the soil, how to build a functional water system, how to rely on animals as part of our nutrient cycle for food production. That's the knowledge that we should be exporting, not a industry built on a lot of iron and oil and pesticides and fertilizers. The only one who's benefiting from that is those companies who are making and selling those products. The people on the other end aren't deriving long-term benefit.
Our guest today has been Jim Gerrish, a longtime friend. Although we got separated for a while, it's good to touch base with you again. Where can people learn more about you and what you're doing? What sources you've mentioned Grass Productivity by Andre Voisin. I've mentioned your management-intensive hyphenated lower I grazing books, which I think are still available from University of Missouri. Kick the Hay Feeding Habit, right?
The MIG book and Kick the Hay Habit had nothing to do with the University of Missouri. Those were, private writing and publications. So
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Absolutely, they're available. So, and we have the consulting services. We sell educational products. Also, our business is American Grazing Lands Services, and you can find us on the web at AmericanGrazingLands.com. You can follow American Grazing Land Services on, Facebook. But as long as you can remember that, American Grazing Land Services, you can find us and all about the products and services we provide and the things that we've been talking about today.
Wonderful. And I'll be sure to include links in notes for the program. Of course, thank you for your time. If you have any questions for me, I'm happy to try to answer them.
Just back to that. How are you, Peter? Is everything good?
Yeah, everything is well with us. The more you learn about what it's like to be a human being on Earth today, the more you realize how overpaid you are. In my case, I don't mean to slight what other people are going through. My family is secure. We're all healthy. I'm blessed with the opportunities that I have. And I get to, talk to some of the world's most fascinating people. Sorry, that would be over there. Sorry. And you can tell I've done this so much. I'm just so professional at it. I think that what so many people are concerned about, people have been working in, and we just need to get better at telling those stories and helping people learn that what I think is really good news, that we can have healthy people, healthy soils, thanks to ruminant animal agriculture, that the evidence is far clearer that too many people are harmed by too little animal source food in their diet, and that any fear about too much is largely mythology based on really poor methodology. And that I think forage agriculture writ large is the solution to all of the problems that we can envision ahead of us. So I'm excited and happy to be banging the drum for forage agriculture.
That's great. I agree 100% in everything you said there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jim. Be well, and I look forward to the next time I can visit your part of the country. I was looking up, I have gotten off on a geology jag over the years and looking about Lake Missoula, but I don't think it quite came down into where you live in those valleys.
I'm not sure about Lake Missoula, but I know we can go 9,000 feet elevation on the mountain and pick up horn coral.
Okay.
Yeah. So
there you go.
Whether that was the bottom of Lake Missoula or, some other inland sea, I'm not sure. I haven't gone on the geology jag yet. Donna would actually probably know that. I do not.
Well, since we in the Willamette Valley end up farming the eastern Washington soil that got blasted out when Lake Missoula drained close to 100 times over the course of that last thaw, when the glaciers melted. It's just something that I find a little humbling, that the Earth has undergone some significant changes over the, and now there's evidence that human beings could well have been here for it. So that would have been a bad day if you were living in the valley.
Yeah, it would have been. So when's the last time Lake Missoula dumped?
Well, I think the figures are it happened somewhere like 18,000 to 15,000 years ago.
Yep, and current anthropology is pushed human occupation in North America back at least that far.
And
30,000. I'm beginning to see 30,000 years that people have been on this continent.
Well, and I started I came across some scholarship looking at what's called Solutrean connection, that maybe one of the groups of people that came to North America came from France, Iberian Peninsula, during the last glacial maximum, and that would perhaps explain some of the ancient, maybe pre-Clovis people on the East Coast, which is hard to explain if they all came in on the west side. And the timing doesn't really line up for a lot of that theory, even though it's conventional wisdom. And the whole conventional wisdom thing is something that we know something about when it comes to forage management or human nutrition, or so it's always interesting to see. Well, I mean, continental, the plate tectonics wasn't accepted until 62. I mean, and you look at the guy Bretz, who said, look, the channeled scablands in Washington, that's all high velocity, large volume water. Oh, no. And it took him most of his career before that was accepted. So there's been a number of these scientific controversies that pushed against the conventional wisdom, but in the fullness of time, people see that maybe that is the way it goes. Science advances one funeral at a time, I think I've heard.
Yep, just like ranching.
Yeah, indeed. Well, again, I wish you the best, and I look forward to the next time that we can get together and do some good planning. You can have whatever you drink, and I'll drink some coffee, and we'll be good.
Yep, we will.
All right. Take good care.
Thank you, Peter. You have a good afternoon.
You too, Jim.
And thanks for the opportunity.
My pleasure.